Hi, I'm Easton Christensen, an electrical engineering student at Utah State University.
Hello, I'm Mike Ellefson, a mechanical engineering student at Utah State University.
Today we built a Morse code translator for our final project in microcontrollers. For this Morse code translator, our first requirement was that it translates Morse code into English.
We also set a requirement for ourselves that the translator translate English back into Morse.
Another requirement that we set was that the translator will be able to receive either Morse or English as an input.
Our fourth requirement that we set was that we implement an LCD to create a better and more seamless user experience.
The fifth factor that we factored into the microcontroller was that we were going to implement a start button to allow the user to decide when the Morse will be began.
And the last requirement that we set for ourselves was that the maximum character limit for either type of translation was to be 32 characters, because that is the maximum amount of characters that our LCD can display at once.
All right, I'm going to be demonstrating our translator to you. It starts off in this waiting for input state. One of our requirements that we had set was that the microcontroller should be able to receive either English or Morse input from this state. And that's the case. We implement our English through a keypad. The keypad cycles through letters just like an old telephone keypad would. And we implement Morse through this blue button. So let's start with English input. So let's say I want to translate SOS, a commonly known Morse translation. I'm just going to start by pressing the button that has the S. And I'm going to continue to press the button until I hit the S. If I go too far, I can just cycle right back through, and it will continue to just cycle through that one letter until I hit the next button. So the O is with the 6. I can go and find the O. While I'm cycling through a single letter, I can't push any of the other buttons. They won't do anything until I hit the next button. And then I can go back to S. Okay, and then submit that letter and say we're good. So now, another requirement was that we would have a start button. This is just something that we can use to make it so that we're not rushed for time while we're inputting. We can start the translation when we're ready. And that's SOS in Morse. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the Morse input. So after it's done going from English to Morse, it goes back to this waiting for input state, where I can go immediately into inputting Morse code. What's going to happen is it will buzz the buzzer in real time so that you can hear the Morse that you are inputting, and it will actively show you the letter that you are currently buzzing out. So if I put 3 dots in a row, it'll start with the letter for 1 dot, then it'll show me the letter for 2 dots, and it will continue to do that. This translation is running on a timer. The SysTick timer is constantly counting so that it knows how long you're pushing the button down for to determine whether it's a dot or a dash, as well as how long you're releasing the button to determine if you're still working on a single letter, or if you're moving on to the next letter or even to the next word. These are just different amounts of time that you release the button, and it will show you that actively as you do it. So if I buzz out SOS again, we did slow down the Morse input just a little bit to make it easier for somebody to input Morse. And you've got SOS. So if I wait for a certain amount of time for Morse, it's the space of 7 dots that I haven't put in a letter, and then I go back into putting in a letter, it will have given me a space because it knows that I'm moving on to the next word. This will continue to display until you're done, and I hit the green button to say I am done with the translation, and it goes back to its original waiting for input state. Another requirement that we set for ourselves was that there was to be a 32 character limit for either type of translation. So right now I've got it up pretty far, so I can input some characters. And I can also show you what we've done for the keypad to input a space into the English is simply to use the asterisk or the pound. Either of those will put in a space. And we submit the space and then put in our last character. And then now what you can see is I'm pushing additional keypad buttons. I'm trying to hit the next button, and it's not doing anything. All it's doing is waiting for you to hit the start button, and it will start the translation. Now I'm going to demonstrate the maximum character limit for the Morse to English translation. So I put in a bunch of E's because they are the fastest Morse character. So I'm on the last character now. So now it's not going to translate anymore. The only thing it's doing once it's hit this point is it's waiting for you to hit the green button. So you can watch this translation and see it as long as you want, and when you're ready, you hit the green button, and it'll go back to waiting for either type of input.
This is our code for our Morse code translator. The functions that we are including here include the startup,
.h file for the STM microcontroller that we use, the LCD.h file that we use to initialize everything within our LCD, and also call functions from the LCD. We also use the string.h file included in the C libraries just to help us work with some of the strings that we use. We then go through, these are all of the functions that we use. Here we have our main function. Within the main function, we first initialize our microcontroller using a function. We initialize our LCD also using a function, and we initialize the SysTick timer using a function. We then clear our LCD to make sure that the screen is clear when we begin, and we begin an infinite loop waiting for an input. From here, we wait to see if it has been an English input using the keypad, and we wait to see if there has been a Morse input using the Morse button. Both of these functions will be explained later in our code. This is our function for waiting for input. This function waits for either a Morse input or an English input. During this function, or within this function, we enter a while loop that essentially checks every single keypad press, or keypad checking for a press, and then also checks for the Morse button to see if it is being pressed. As soon as one of these is pressed, it says either receiving English or receiving Morse to 1, breaking it out of the loop in the main statement, and pushing it forward through the code.
The next function is our English input function, which is a big loop while it's receiving English until you hit the start button. Receiving English, like I said, will be in this loop while you are receiving English. It's going to go through and basically loop through the keypad. It's going to drive each row 0, row 1, row 2, and then row 3. And within each row, it's going to be checking each column. It's going to check column 0, 1, 2, and 3 to see if they are active, to determine what button is being pressed. If you push a particular button, it's going to enter this function multi-press, which we'll explain later. That's basically checking for how many times you are pushing that button. This is what makes it so that it won't accept any other buttons except for the one that you're currently pressing. Once it exits multi-press, it will return the value of the character, and then we're going to move on to the next character. At the very end, after it's done, it's going to check if the start button has been pressed, and if it has, we're going to stop receiving English, and we're going to call the Morse output function, and then clear the LCD. After that, it's going to, if we haven't pressed the start button, it's going to concatenate the newest character into this string, keeping track of the characters that you want translated. After that, we have a check for if you have reached the maximum character limit. It will enter this loop that is only checking for the start button to be pressed. This is our multi-press function. So when you push a button, it enters this function, and it goes into a loop that's waiting for the next button to be pressed. And it's basically just checking that same button that you pressed to see if you're pressing it again. And it's keeping track of how many times you've pushed the button in a row. Once you've hit the maximum number of presses for a specific button, it's going to reset back to the starting value. This is the Morse output function. All it does is it accepts a character, a string, and it loops through each of the characters within that string, and it goes into the Morse library for each of those. This Morse library is what actually beeps out the dots and dashes.
This function is for the Morse input. Within this function, we we recognize that we are receiving Morse. While the Morse button is pressed, it buzzes the buzzer. If you give it a dot, it will input a small d into our string concatenation, into the string Morse string. Otherwise, it will input a big D. From here, it will display the character that is being translated by the English library function. Then, while the Morse button is not being pressed and you're still giving input, if the start button is pressed, it will stop receiving input. Otherwise, it will move on to the next letter or recognize if you need a space in between words here within this if statement. The next two functions are the dot and the dash function. Both of these will recognize and sound the buzzer if it recognizes a small d or a big D within the English to Morse translation. It will also input a space, and it will wait for a set amount of time for a space in between the two words that you input. This function is our Morse library. This is the library of every English letter translated into a string of Morse dots and dashes. It is quite extensive. It contains A through Z as well as 0 through 9 and a space character. And then it translates these into dots and dashes and calls the function dot, dash, or space depending on which character it is on it within the string. So if it's a big D, it calls dash. If it's small d, it calls dot, etc. Here is our English library. It essentially does the same thing except from Morse to English, and it then translates as well in the end and prints it to the LCD screen.